In 1967, American forces in South Vietnam launched a series of powerful attacks on the Vietnamese communist guerrillas. The aim was to take the war to the NLF's biggest units by attacking their bases in overwhelming strength. The Americans hoped that the guerrillas would stand and fight. They could then annihilate them with vastly superior firepower. The offensives were designed to use the tactics of search and destroy on the grandest scale yet. Some of the biggest helicopter operations of the war were mounted to try and trap entire Viet Cong regiments. More guns and aircraft were called in to support the attacks than had ever been unleashed on a Vietnam battlefield. The Americans meant to damage the Viet Cong so badly they would be unable to carry on the war. In fact, the Americans would fail to wipe out the Viet Cong's biggest units. Despite heavy losses in men and equipment, the guerrillas would return even stronger, ready to launch their own offensive campaign. By mid-1965, the mission of American troops in South Vietnam was changing fast. They had come to secure air bases, but now they were actively looking for combat with the Viet Cong. On May 18, 1965, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, the first U.S. Army infantry unit to arrive in Vietnam, began operations. Its first task was to sweep a wide area around its base near Saigon. The 173rd met no real resistance. There were thousands of Viet Cong troops in the Saigon area, but they remained elusive. More American troops arrived. As the weeks went on, questions were asked about the whole policy. Was it wise to send a conventional army with its slow-moving, heavily armed infantry, its planes, its tanks, against guerrilla units that might be impossible to pin down? The U.S. commander in Vietnam, General William C. Westmoreland, insisted that the Army could find and beat the enemy. There were soon encouraging signs. In August 1965, in Operation Starlight, U.S. Marines surrounded a Viet Cong regiment of 2,000 men and defeated them in a full-scale battle. The next major challenge was posed by the NLF's allies, the professional troops of the North Vietnamese Army. By September 1965, two North Vietnamese Army regiments, the 32nd and the 33rd, had moved down the Ho Chi Minh Trail and infiltrated from Cambodia into South Vietnam. The 66th Regiment was following close behind. The plan was to take the provincial capital, Pleiku, and advance along Highway 19 to the coast at Kinan, splitting the south in two. The Americans were determined to block the NVA's attempt to reach Kina. The idea was to place in the Anke Valley the most mobile force they possessed, the 1st Air Cavalry Division. The Air Cavalry was the first formation anywhere in the world designed around the helicopter. The division was 15,000 strong and had 480 machines, 5 times the number of a normal infantry division. The whole idea had, until recently, been an experiment with an eye to any future war in Europe. No one really knew how it would work in a place like Vietnam. Combat units of the 1st Cavalry began to arrive at An Khe in mid-September 1965. By October, the division was fully operational. Its base, Camp Radcliffe, had grown into a massive complex of helicopter pads, supply dumps, accommodation and maintenance facilities. For the officers and men of the Air Cavalry, there was a great deal to prove, and they were determined to take the battle to the enemy. For their part, North Vietnamese Army commanders were just as keen for a fight as the Americans. Their 6,000 troops, already in the border area, meant to keep up the pressure on South Vietnamese government forces. At the same time, they aimed to find out how well U.S. troops would fight and how their own soldiers would cope with American weapons and tactics. After infiltrating into the south, the 32nd and the 33rd North Vietnamese regiments had established a base area on the high ground of the Chupong Massif. On October 20th, 1965, the 33rd Regiment laid siege to an American Special Forces camp at Plai Mai. After a siege that lasted 6 days, the South Vietnamese Army, backed by the U.S. Air Cavalry, secured that camp, and both NVA regiments withdrew to the Chupong. There they meant to join with the newly arrived 66th Regiment before renewing their campaign. The American plan was to fly in the whole of the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry to find the NVA regiments. It was the first time U.S. troops would face NVA regulars. The first step was to create an artillery fire support base near the Chupong at Landing Zone Falcon. Next, the lead elements of the 1st Battalion landed at LZ X-Ray. Right in front of them were nearly all the 66th and 33rd NVA regiments. When Company B pushed towards the spur of the Chupong, it was attacked immediately, and a platoon was encircled. Company A was also pinned down by fierce fire before the rest of the 1st Battalion was landed. A and B companies then launched attacks to relieve the encircled platoon, but were driven back. The following morning, the Americans, reinforced by another company, were hit by waves of NVA troops. Heavy fire support wreaked havoc on the attackers, and by now another American battalion was on its way overland. Conceding defeat, the shattered North Vietnamese regiments began to pull back towards the Y Trang Valley in the safety of Cambodia. After the fight at LZ X-Ray, the Chu Pong was bombed by almost 100 B-52s, each unloading 17 tons of high explosives. For the next 10 days, the NVA regiments were pursued relentlessly by the Americans. But although the North Vietnamese were in retreat, they were still capable of hitting back. In one textbook ambush, mounted by a rearguard battalion of the 66th Regiment, 155 Americans were killed. For U.S. forces, it was the most costly day of the war so far. In the Battle of the Y Trang Valley and the Pleiku operation, the 1st Cavalry Division lost 300 dead. But the NVA had suffered much worse. 1,300 North Vietnamese soldiers had been killed and many more wounded. It was a clear-cut victory for the Americans. 2 enemy regiments were all but smashed, and there was now little danger of South Vietnam being cut in two. The Y Trang battle was a major boost for U.S. commanders. It seemed to prove their strategy was the right one. The enemy's big units could be made to stand and fight, and take heavy casualties in the process. If the Communists could be forced into more battles like Y Trang, they would quickly suffer such losses they would have to abandon their whole campaign. The final push to use American combat forces in South Vietnam had come from President Lyndon Johnson himself. Yet, he had never wanted to fight a war in Asia. Johnson's priority was social reform, his Great Society program.